I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my mother-in-law walked into the kitchen and told me I had 30 days to get out of her son's house. She didn't knock. She never knocked. I had lived in that house for 4 years, and I still hadn't figured out whether she genuinely didn't understand the concept of private space, or whether she simply didn't think it applied to me. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, though she had never once thought of it that way, and set her hands flat on the surface like she was about to chair a board meeting. My husband was standing in the doorway behind her. He was not looking at me. "We've been talking," she said, "and we think it's time for a change. Nolan needs space to focus on his career. You being here isn't helping with that." I looked at her. I looked at my husband. The coffee maker was still dripping behind me. The sound of it filled the room because nobody else was filling it. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew exactly what it meant. She smiled the way people smile when they've decided the conversation is already over. "It means we'd like you to be out by the end of the month. You're a capable woman, Renata. You'll land on your feet." Nolan still hadn't looked up. I set my mug down on the counter. I didn't say anything. I walked upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for 4 years, and looked out the window at the backyard. The garden I had built from nothing. The fence I had paid to have repaired. The deck that existed because I had spent an entire summer weekend helping the contractor because we couldn't afford to have the full job done professionally. What my mother-in-law didn't know, what she had never thought to ask about, not once in 4 years, was that she was sitting in my house. Not her son's. Not theirs. Mine. Every square foot of that property had been purchased with money I had saved, money I had negotiated for, money I had structured into a down payment, while Nolan was between jobs and his mother, was busy telling anyone who would listen what a promising future he had. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we actually got here. I grew up in Brampton, the daughter of parents who had immigrated from the Philippines before I was born and built their life in Canada the way a lot of people do. Carefully, slowly, with an almost religious respect for financial discipline. My mother kept a notebook with every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. My father drove the same car for 16 years. I absorbed all of it. By the time I finished my undergraduate degree in accounting at Ryerson, I had a small amount of student debt, a very clear understanding of compound interest, and a deep personal allergy to financial carelessness. I met Nolan at a work function. He was funny and warm, and had a way of making a room feel lighter just by being in it. We dated for 2 years, got engaged, and moved in together into a rented apartment in Mississauga. While we talked about what came next, I want to be honest about Nolan, because this story isn't really about him being a villain. He wasn't. He was just someone who had never been asked to look clearly at the people around him, because his mother had always been there to arrange the view. His mother, Beverly, was the kind of woman who had an opinion about everything, and had never once been asked to justify any of them. She was in her late 60s, recently widowed, and had reorganized her entire identity around being Nolan's primary support system, which would have been understandable if Nolan hadn't been 34 years old. She called him every morning. She forwarded him articles about career opportunities he should pursue. She had, on more than one occasion, shown up at our apartment with containers of food and the specific energy of someone inspecting a property they were planning to purchase. She never said she disliked me outright. She was too precise for that. What she did instead was make me invisible. She would ask Nolan questions about decisions we had made together, as though I hadn't been part of making them. She would thank him for meals I had cooked. She would refer to our apartment as your place when talking to him and say nothing when talking to me. I was furniture. Acceptable furniture, maybe even useful furniture, but furniture. 2 years after we got engaged, Nolan's company relocated his division. We had 2 months to decide whether to stay in Mississauga or move. We had also been saving, separately and together, for a house, and the timing intersected in a way that felt either like an opportunity or a trap, depending on which day you ask me. What happened next is the part I need to explain carefully, because it matters more than anything else in this story. Nolan's mother owned a property in Hamilton that she had been renting out since her husband died. It was a decent house, 3 bedrooms, finished basement, good bones but in need of work. She had mentioned selling it several times but had never followed through. When the relocation came up, she offered to sell it to us at below market value, which on the surface sounded generous, except that the condition attached to the offer was that she would retain the right to live with us for 3 months every year and would have input on any major renovations. Nolan thought this was reasonable. He genuinely did. He came to me with it one Sunday morning with the kind of careful optimism that meant he had already half decided, and he laid out the financial case. Below market purchase price, good neighborhood, space to grow. His mother would help with childcare someday. All of that was true. What was also true, I had been watching Beverly for 2 years. I knew what input on renovations meant. I knew what 3 months a year meant with a woman who didn't knock. I said I needed time to think. And I thought, here is what I did with that thinking. I went to my own lawyer, not the family lawyer Nolan usually used, who had done work for Beverly in the past, but a real estate lawyer I found independently. I looked at the numbers myself, all of them, not just the purchase price, but the outstanding property tax balance Beverly had let accumulate, the condition report that flagged the roof and the electrical panel, and the rental income history that showed the property had been losing money for the past 18 months because Beverly had stopped maintaining it properly after her husband died. The below market price, when you factored in all of that, was not actually below market. It was slightly above it. I went back to Nolan with all of this laid out in a spreadsheet. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "So what do you want to do?" I said I wanted to buy the house, but I wanted to buy it properly. We negotiated. Beverly came down on the price. The 3 months per year condition was softened to extended visits as agreed by all parties. The renovation input clause was removed entirely. And because I was the one with the stable income, Nolan had just started a new position and was still in his probationary period, which meant his mortgage application would have been complicated. The house went into my name alone. Beverly didn't love that part. She made a comment at dinner about how unusual it was, how in her day couples put things in both names, how she just wanted to make sure Nolan was protected. I smiled and said the bank had made a recommendation, and we were following it, which was true enough. Nolan didn't push back. He trusted me with money in the way that people trust mechanics with their cars, completely, and without reading the invoice. We moved in. I spent the first year pouring money into the house. The roof, the panel, the basement bathroom that hadn't had functioning drainage since the previous tenants. Nolan helped where he could, but he was adjusting to a new job, new city, new routine. The house was mine in the way that things become yours when you're the one who shows up for them. Beverly visited. She visited a lot, more than we had agreed, and each visit was slightly longer than the last. She had opinions about the paint colors I chose and shared them without being asked. She rearranged the spice cabinet once, and when I put it back, she looked at me with an expression that I had learned to translate as "you're being difficult." Nolan thought she was just being helpful. I had a different read on it. The visits stretched. What had been agreed as extended stays became something closer to a permanent presence. Beverly had given up her own apartment. She mentioned this casually one evening over dinner, the way you might mention that you'd switched shampoo brands, not the way you'd mention that you had made a unilateral decision about where you were going to live. She was staying with us now, indefinitely. I raised this with Nolan privately. He said his mother was getting older. She was lonely. It wasn't forever. Could I please just be flexible? I said flexibility has limits, and this was approaching one of them. He said I was being cold. I said I was being honest, which is what happens when nobody makes room for honesty and it has to find its own way out. We went on like this for about 7 months. 7 months of Beverly in my kitchen every morning. Beverly asking Nolan at dinner what he thought of the neighborhood instead of asking us both. Beverly leaving her things in the guest room, and then slowly in the hallway, and then slowly on the main bathroom counter. 7 months of Nolan choosing peace over clarity every single time I brought up a concern. And then the morning of the coffee. She came in without knocking. She sat down. She told me that Nolan's sister, who I had met exactly 4 times, was coming from Calgary with her 2 kids because her marriage had broken down and she needed support. There was not enough room, Beverly said. These things happen. Family comes first. She used my name the way people use names when they want to establish authority. Renata, you're young, you're adaptable, you have options. We need you to find somewhere else to stay while Lynette gets back on her feet. I waited for her to finish. Then I said, Beverly, where would I go? She looked faintly annoyed at the question, as though the logistics were my problem. A short-term rental. A friend's place. You're resourceful. I looked at Nolan. He was standing in the doorway, same as always, looking at the floor. I packed a bag. Not the whole bag. Just enough for a few days. I drove to my parents' house in Brampton because that was the only place I could think of where someone would be glad to see me, and I sat at their kitchen table while my mother made tea, and I tried to figure out what I actually felt. Not angry. Something quieter than angry. something that felt like finally having the information I had been missing about my own life. My father called his friend, who was a contractor. My mother called her cousin, who was a paralegal. I called nobody. I sat and thought, and what I thought about, for the first time in 4 years, was the deed. The deed that had my name on it, just my name. The property at 44 Alderton Crescent, Hamilton, Ontario, registered to me, unencumbered, no co-owner, no spousal interest registered, because Nolan and I were not yet married when we purchased it, a fact that Beverly had commented on once as evidence of my reluctance to commit, not realizing it was one of the most significant financial realities of our relationship. Nolan called that night. He said he was sorry about the way things had been presented. He did not say he thought it was wrong. He said he hoped I understood. I said I understood everything very clearly now. Beverly called the next morning. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring again. On the third call I answered. She did not open with an apology. She opened with a question. Have you found a place? And underneath the question was the assumption I had grown so used to hearing that I had almost stopped noticing it. The assumption that my position in that house was conditional, negotiable, something that could be reassigned based on whoever's need was loudest in the room. I said, Beverly, I need to ask you something. Do you know whose name is on the deed for the house on Alderton? Silence. Nolan, she said, or both of yours. It's mine, I said. Only mine. It's been mine since we purchased it 3 years ago. I own the house, Beverly. You've been living in my house. The silence that followed was a different kind. The first silence had been assumption. This one was the sound of assumption collapsing. She said, that's not possible. I said, I can send you the land registry document if you'd like. She said there must have been a mistake. I said there was no mistake. She said Nolan would know about this. I said, he does. What happened in the following 48 hours was instructive in the way that crises are always instructive. They show you exactly who people are when the comfortable version of things stops being available. Beverly called Nolan, who called me, who repeated what I had told his mother. He was quiet for a long time after I confirmed it. Then he said, why didn't you tell her? I said, she never asked, you never asked. Nobody in the last 3 years has asked whose name is on that property. Not once. He didn't have an answer for that. Beverly called her daughter in Calgary, who apparently had not yet packed, which told me the timeline on Lynette's arrival had been more flexible than Beverly had presented. Lynette called me and was considerably kinder than her mother, which made the conversation easier. She said she was sorry for the disruption. I said I hoped she found what she needed and that I genuinely wished her well through her divorce, which I meant. None of this was Lynette's fault. Beverly's brother-in-law called me. He was not unkind, but he was very clearly on a mission, and the mission was to suggest that family property, and here he used the phrase, family property, with the confidence of a man who had not read any documents, should be managed with generosity and flexibility. I listened. I said I had been flexible for 4 years. I said the house was purchased with my savings, my name, my mortgage qualification, and my labor, and that I was open to discussing the future, but not to having those facts reframed as selfishness. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're a sharp one, aren't you?" I said, "I'm just someone who kept her paperwork." I went back to the house on Alderton on the 4th day. I had spoken to a family lawyer in the interim, not because I intended to do anything dramatic, but because I needed to understand my position clearly before I walked back into a room with people who had spent years being careless with my position. Beverly was in the living room. Nolan was at the table. Neither of them spoke when I came in. I set my bag by the door and I sat down across from them, and I said what I had come to say. I told them that I was not there to remove anyone from the property. I was not going to give Beverly a notice to vacate, and I was not going to ask Nolan to choose between his wife and his mother. Because that was not the kind of person I was, and not the kind of marriage I wanted. What I was going to do was establish some things clearly, out loud, in the same room, so that nobody could later claim they hadn't known. The house was mine. Every financial decision related to it would go through me. Beverly was welcome to continue her stay on the understanding that it had an end date, to be decided by me in conversation with Nolan, and that end date meant a real date on a calendar, not a moving target. Lynette's visit was welcome. 2 weeks, with the guest room, and I would be glad to have the kids in the backyard. The spice cabinet would remain as I had organized it. Beverly started to say something about how she had sacrificed, and how nobody understood what she had given up. I let her say it. I had learned by then that people need to finish their sentences, even when the sentences don't change anything. When she was done, I said, "I know you've worked hard for this family. I know losing Nolan's father was devastating. I know you love your son. And I need you to also know that I have spent 4 years making sure this home was a real home, and I'm going to keep doing that. But I'm going to do it as the person I am, not the furniture you've been comfortable ignoring. She looked at me for a long time. Her expression was something I hadn't seen from her before, and it took me a moment to identify it. It was the expression of someone who was genuinely seeing me for the first time. She didn't apologize that day. That took about a week, and when it came, it was short and imprecise, the kind of apology people give when they're still not entirely sure what they're apologizing for. But she gave it. She looked at me and said, "I think I've been unfair to you." And I accepted it, not because it was complete, but because it was real, and real is rarer than complete. Nolan and I had harder conversations over the weeks that followed. Not shouting, not ultimatums, just the kind of honest talking that should have been happening for years and hadn't been. Because it was easier to let his mother fill the room than to sit with each other in the quiet and figure out what we actually needed. He told me he had always known the house was mine on paper, but had stopped thinking about what that meant in practice. I told him that was exactly the problem. We went to couples counseling. I want to say that directly because I think it's the detail people most often leave out of these kinds of stories, as though the ending is just the moment the truth comes out and then everything is fine. It's not like that. The truth coming out is just the beginning of the actual work. Beverly moved to a seniors community in Burlington about 3 months after all of this. It was her choice, genuinely her choice, and I think it was the right one for her. She needed a life that was actually hers, not a life organized around the orbit of her son. She texts me occasionally now. Usually pictures of the garden at her complex, sometimes a recipe. It's careful and it's new, and I'm not sure what it will grow into, but I don't close the door on it. Lynette and her kids visited for 10 days in August. The kids were 5 and 8, and they were wonderful, and they ran in the backyard I had built and shrieked on the deck I had helped put in. And for those 10 days, the house felt full in a way it hadn't in a long time. I repainted the front door in November, dark green with brass hardware. Beverly had always said it should be red. She sent me a text that said, "I like the green." I stood at the door for a moment after I read it, holding my phone, not sure exactly what I felt. It was something. It was slow and complicated and not finished yet. But it was mine.